James Gunn's The Suicide Squad opens in US theaters this weekend. Apparently it already opened in other parts of the world, so let's talk about it. The Suicide Squad is the second Suicide Squad movie in the DCEU, but it's not really a sequel to 2016's Suicide Squad. It's a standalone story that has a few of the same characters, but no continuing story threads from any previous DCEU films. This is also an interesting film because the only reason we're getting a James Gunn Suicide Squad movie is because he was briefly fired by Disney over some old tweets. WB snatched him up immediately, let him go wild and make a Suicide Squad film, and then Disney rehired him for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, so we're gonna get both movies. Real quick, before I let you know what I thought about it, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Share your thoughts on James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Do you think it's awesome? Or is it not quite living up to all the hype? Let me know down below in the comment section, and let's get started with the good. And the first thing you gotta talk about with this movie is that it has a distinct style and flavor. This is a James Gunn movie. From the way the story is told to the way it transitions between segments, the nature of the humor, how ultra violent it is, it has a unique vision. A lot of comic book movies come out these days, and some of them can have a little bit of an assembly line feel to them where they do everything right, but they're following perfectly inside of the template. Other movies that the DCU have put out clearly feel like they were designed by a committee taking over a movie, redesigning it after doing focus groups to try and decide who to appeal to and how to get the broadest possible audience. This is the opposite of that. This feels like one unified vision that's distinct and has unique elements to it. Along those same lines, while it has the big spectacle you want, the superheroes, the heroic antics, it also takes big inspiration from 50-year-old war movies, especially, or most obviously, The Dirty Dozen, where you kind of have this ragtag group of criminals going in on a mission. That's The Dirty Dozen, except it's set in the DCEU, but it has all the big explosions, the high body count, and a bunch of the heroes of our movie dying horrible deaths. All that to say, while it delivers what you want from a 21st century comic book blockbuster, it still kind of cuts its own space inside the genre, both because it's this old war movie, but also because it's told by James Gunn in his voice, the way he tells stories and designs characters. Speaking of the characters, it's of course a very lively bunch of characters, and whether they're designed to be 100% kind of comic relief, over the top characters, or some of the more heartfelt ones, they all have things about them that make them unique inside of the story and serve a specific purpose. Even some of the characters that aren't there all that long, they're each designed to show a different way that one of these villains might respond to the scenario that they're in. They're given different versions of a tragic ending or a heroic moment, a character arc, different ways to be funny. So while there's a whole bunch of characters in this movie, they all have something distinct about them that makes you remember all of them in some way. And that's really impressive when you have 17 different characters, but it still feels like all of them have a place inside the story that's being told. Continuing on the characters, the movie does a really nice job of balancing the moral complexity, where you've got a bunch of people who are our protagonists, but that doesn't mean that they have a good moral compass. The people sending them on the mission aren't necessarily good guys either, and it finds just the right way to allow our characters to do heroic things without ever sacrificing the fact that they're not really good people, but each of them still have certain value sets, and different members of the team have different value sets that motivate them in different ways and at different times as you go throughout the film. And that adds extra layers of conflict as well as payoff as you go throughout the story, because characters like Rick Flag Peacemaker and King Shark have very different worldviews, very different value sets, and it comes into conflict as you go throughout the story, but plays out in interesting ways. Another thing I enjoyed about the film is that while there's no shortage of CGI here, it was filmed on actual sets with real explosions and stunt work taking place. And so when you're in a real environment, it's much easier to buy into what you're seeing when CGI things are added into an environment rather than when you know they're standing in front of a green screen. The real sets, the actual fire, grounds the spectacle in a reality that we can buy into. And finally, this is a movie made for adults. So many blockbusters these days have that PG-13 rating to appeal to as broad of an audience as is possible, but when you do that, you're not targeting a specific audience and trying to lean in as much as you can. And WB let James Gunn just go for it with this movie. It has some dark humor. The protagonists of this story do horrible things on their mission, and he was allowed to tell this morally complex story with a group of very bad people that say a bunch of very bad language with a bunch of gory sequences, and it makes it interesting and unique and stand out. James Gunn has delivered a fresh comic book movie in an oversaturated market that's highly entertaining, very emotional, and deeply personal. From there, let's move on to the mixed aspects of the film. And the big thing here is that because it is a hard R comic book movie with James Gunn's very distinct sense of humor, it's not gonna match everyone's taste. A lot of people seem to be absolutely loving it. Some people are gonna watch it and it's just too vulgar, too extreme. The protagonists do too many awful things for them to be able to buy into it. I took my wife to go see it. It was definitely way too much for her. And so while she appreciated certain elements of it, especially King Shark played by Stallone, it was just too vulgar for her. Second thing you gotta know about this one in the mixed category, I felt the trailers probably showed too much. Granted, I talk about movies for a living. I put out a video yesterday where I dissected the trailers to try and piece together who's gonna die, but I was able to piece together quite a bit, and it wasn't that I was that clever. It was just pretty obvious from the trailers what takes place in a lot of this film and when certain people die. And I think in particular some of the stuff with Bloodsport and his kind of character arc, I just think they played too many of the payoff shots that are in the third act in the trailers, especially ones that came out months ago. So I think they showed a bit too much in the trailers. Final thing you gotta know here in the mixed category, there are two scenes during the credits. One is right at the beginning, one is right at the end, and both are worth checking out. Neither one of them blew my mind or anything, but they are certainly additions worth checking out. From there, let's move on to the bad. The big thing here is that the villains aren't particularly interesting or given a whole lot of depth to them. Naturally, when you have a movie with 17 members of the Suicide Squad, there's just not enough time to go around to have a villain with a compelling backstory, developed motivations, and so you gotta have these generic military dictators turning over the country, and then the stuff kind of going on with Starro. The plot is interesting, the scheme, the mission are interesting, but the villains themselves really aren't. Even as you get into the big third act showdown with Starro, it's a fun scenario, but even as the trailers say, it's just a kaiju doing stuff. There's not a character there with a bunch of depth and intrigue into it. It's just a very fun foe for our villains to go up against. And then with this movie, it's obviously trying to have these big, lively, wild, and weird characters. And I think just a few too many of the main characters were full-blown cartoons, whereas most of them, at some point in time, you had that moment where it clarified why they act the way that they do, what's motivating them. A few of them, in particular Peacemaker, they never kind of go there, and they do some stuff with him in the third act where it just felt like we needed to have something more grounded in his personality and as a character for that to have more meaning. And because it doesn't do that, he is just this over-the-top cartoonish contradiction of a character that I think it undermines some of the payoff of what happens. Real quick, before I give you my final thoughts on this one, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what did you think about The Suicide Squad? Is it living up to the hype, or were you a little bit disappointed by it? Also, coming this weekend, I'm going to rank all 45 theatrically released DC films. It's gonna be in 3 parts. It's gonna start this weekend. Check it out. Now, there's a lot of hyperbole surrounding this film. Its initial Rotten Tomatoes score was a 100%. To be clear, this is a highly entertaining film. It feels fresh because it's actually for adults and told with a unique director's vision, and it has a lot of heart. But I think all the talk about it being the greatest DC movie ever made, that sounds like it's a bit much to me, but it is still really good. Overall, I'm going with an A- on the entertainment scale, 9 out of 10, and go see this movie if you like hard R action comedies. However, don't take your 8-year-old like the person that was sitting next to me. That was a little bit weird. If you want more content like this, check out that video right over there where I did my predictions for this movie. It's an interesting to watch before and after you've seen the movie. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.